This is Anuj Rastogi, and you are listening to the AwokenWord podcast, or at least you're planning to listen to the AwokenWord podcast, though that may change, and I will have absolutely no control over that. On today's episode, I had an incredible conversation with a woman that is an absolute force of nature. Today we've got Raheel Raza, and for some of you, you may have heard the name, and for others, you'll get to know her. Raheel, or as you'll hear me refer to her with respect, as I call her, Raheel Ji. Raheel Ji is an absolutely incredible woman. She's of Pakistani background, living in Canada, but truly a citizen of the world. I can't even keep track of all of the incredible things that she does. She's an author, she's a journalist, she's an activist, she's a speaker, she's a motivator. In many cases, she's been a counselor for youth who are at risk. She has been working directly with the Human Rights Commission of the UN on issues of radicalization within the Muslim world, of reform, and really working closely with youth and different communities to really transform things for an entire community of people in a very important way. She's incredibly passionate. She's also incredibly brave, and she is taking on a very, very challenging situation with an incredible level of class and humility and focus and passion. On top of everything else that she's doing for the world, she's actually got a world of her own as a grandmother, as a mother of 2 grown sons who have their own families now, and she really does balance a whole number of things. I had an incredible conversation with her, and I'm lucky that I did have it because we were scheduled the week before, but unfortunately one of her grandchildren fell ill and she had to attend to grandma duties. That shows you that she not only takes care of what's happening within her circle, she's also taking care of what's happening on this giant spinning ball that we call Earth. She has in the past appeared on Bill Maher. She's appeared on Bill O'Reilly. She is definitely a well-versed, very articulate, and incredible woman. Sometimes you just really need to have an honest conversation with each other, and that's what today really was about. So apologies in advance for some strange audio glitches that you might hear. My system was on the fritz a little bit, but it shouldn't really get in the way of anything. So without further ado, I present to you Raheel Raza. This podcast is my humble attempt to bring a grain of sand of goodness rising to the beach of human experience. Inspiring. This podcast is my love letter to all of you. The AwokenWord podcast. So we're joined here today by Raheel Raza. Raheel, I'm going to have to call you Raheel G just out of respect. There's just no way that I can't. It would feel a little bit awkward for me. So thank you for being here, Raheel G.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So Raheel G, for our listeners who don't know about you, who haven't heard your name or seen some of your work, what would you like to tell them about yourself and what it is that you do?
Well, I am a human rights activist. I have an organization called the Council for Muslims Facing Tomorrow, which I created about 5 years ago. And I'm also one of the founding members of the Muslim Reform Movement. But that's not all. I am connected to a lot of international movements because, as you know, human rights is across the board. It's a global movement. But in the within human rights, my particular personal interest is in the rights of women. I was born in Pakistan. I have been a Canadian citizen for 30 years. Lived here, I would say a proud Canadian. And Canada is where I found my voice because I was born in Pakistan. I grew up in a culture where women were supposed to be seen and not heard. And I think I was born an activist. I always wanted to be heard.
Right.
So when I found my freedoms to speak out and say what I want and write what I want, I am a writer and a journalist at heart. My first passion is writing. I keep getting sidetracked into other things, but that is what I love doing more than anything else.
And outside of all of your work, who is the Raheel Raza that, the people who know you know?
Well, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a grandmother, and I think at this point in my life, I'm 68 years old, not ashamed to say that. At this point in my life, my grandchildren are my joy, they are my therapy, they are my inspiration. And I would say without hesitation that a lot of the work that I do today for human rights, for a better world, is for the future of my grandchildren. I have 4 grandchildren, 2 girls and 2 boys. And it's the joy of my life. I am retired, but I work now more than I ever did when I had a full-time job because activism never stops.
Right.
It's 24/7. I travel a lot because my work calls me to different parts of the world to speak, to give advice to various governments. I've been accredited with the United Nations Human Rights Council for 5 years, traveled there thrice a year to Geneva, to the UNHRC. And that has been a very interesting learning experience, met a lot of people. And so it's a journey. It's a journey that started when I was a young girl and I saw injustice. I saw economic disparity. I saw gender inequality. I saw patriarchy. And I rebelled against it. So in some ways, you could say I'm a rebel, but with a cause.
Sure.
And, this has been my journey, and it is a continuous journey. I'm learning constantly along the way.
I think your business card could read International Woman of Mystery. That might also be a good tag.
Possibly, yes. I wear many caps, and I think that's what sometimes muddles the whole idea, what is my bio, who am I, what do I do? I guess you could say that I step into a vacuum when I see that there is a need.
Right.
There are many causes, and obviously, as one person, I can't change the whole world. But I do have a very strong belief that every drop counts, every word counts, every action counts, and that every individual can make a difference. So, when I mentor youth, when I speak to young people and they feel frustrated and their backs are against the wall and they cry out, what can I do? And you'll note that many people don't do anything because they think that what they will do won't make a difference. And I
Right.
remind them that everyone can make a difference. And if everybody did pitch in to make the world a better place, it would be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're preaching to the converted here. There's a political cartoon I saw over and over, especially during recent elections, where you've got a whole group of people on one side of an aisle that said, I didn't vote because it didn't make a difference. And then you've got a few people that said, I voted because it makes a difference. And that apathy, that herd mentality of either thinking that someone else is going to be doing the work or that I can't make a difference no matter what I do, it paralyzes us. And so progress is slow, but somebody has to keep pushing forward.
Well, that's what it is. And I think that for each one of us, it's a personal journey. It's about our own conscience. There are many times that I think that it would be wonderful if I could just be a full-time grandmother and do nothing else but play with my grandchildren, which I love. But then I see what is happening in the world around me, and I hear people's stories. And I know that for me, ethically and morally, I couldn't sleep at night if I didn't think that I was doing something to make a difference. And this was beautifully validated about, I think, 15 years ago. I was in New York. And there was, just at random, I read a note saying that Andrew Harvey was speaking. And I don't know if you know of Andrew Harvey is a spiritual philosopher and guru and has done a lot of work on Rumi and all the other, the spiritual activists. So I went to hear him speak. And there's one thing he said that just stayed with me. He said, if the world is burning and on the day of judgment, God is going to ask you, what did you do to make a difference? And he said, the world is burning around us, and each one of us needs to put in that one drop to put out that fire. And that has resonated with me and stayed with me. And he spoke about something called spiritual activism, which is the title of my book on spirituality. He said that it's not just about political changes. He says that those of us who are believers, who are part of a faith, which I am.
Right.
I'm a believer. He says those of us who are believers have to bring about a spiritual change, because when the human spirit changes, then the world changes.
Right. So true. I find it interesting in today's world that things have just gotten so much more polarized, or at least they feel more polarized. It's just that we're constantly reminded of that. There was once a time where people would just have conversations in front of each other face to face, and they would have shouting matches and they would yell at each other. I remember being in London years ago, probably almost 20 years ago at this point, and in Hyde Park, they had something called Speaker's Corner, where you basically bring your own soapbox and you stand up there and you yell and you shout at other people, and people will listen to your message or not. And now we've moved into the modern age with the internet in particular, which has provided such an infrastructure for so many great things, and yet has also been co-opted for so much shouting and trolling and bullying. And if we were ever polarized, it definitely feels very clear that today is one of those times, and we just see it all around us. I wish people would do more of this, just have these conversations.
It's extremely important. I think we are suffering from a lack of freedoms to express our opinions. And you're right, we're polarized, because I never really understood what left and right was until I experienced it myself. This idea that, you can't express an opinion. This is what the world is all about. I grew up and was brought up for the first 2 decades of my life in a country where we did not know what freedom of speech or freedom of expression was. And I think people need to understand how much we cherish those freedoms, because we live in a country where there is, technically there is freedom of speech. But that freedom of speech is now being stifled. Mm-hmm. You look at universities, you look at the internet, you've got fake news, you've got these social media platforms. No, technology is a wonderful thing. But at my age, I still want a personal conversation.
Right.
If I have to wish someone, if I have to speak to someone, I would rather pick up the phone and talk to them. So what I see happening is that human interaction is getting far less. It's so, because in a Facebook post or on a tweet, you can say whatever you want. You can even do it anonymously. You can slam people, and they do all the time. Everyone doesn't have to agree with me. It's my opinion, it's my journey, it's the work that I do. But let's talk about it.
Right.
So this concept of let's talk about it is not happening anymore, because people are not... let me rephrase it. People are afraid to have open dialogue and discussion, especially our youth, because they've been ostracized, they've been criticized. It's always about, you can't say that. Now, that's how I grew up.
Right.
So in the first early years of my life, we were not allowed to question. We were not allowed to question, especially faith. It was, you have to do this because you are a Muslim. Well, my children are another generation. They are the why generation. They asked every question.
Right.
Why do we have to do this? So in a way, we had to relearn our faith and our values, because we needed to explain to them, this is why you do it. And that is something that is not happening at a large scale.
When you had to relearn it, as you put it, did you find in going through all of that, the journey and the process of that, did you find that certain things either took a greater place in your own mind and some things fell out of favor? When you relearned that, did you find yourself critically reevaluating and thinking, does this actually make sense?
Oh, absolutely. This concept of critical thinking was not something that was ever gifted to us as we were children. We were, in fact, told, don't think critically, because, that's not something that you need to do. So, yes, relearning was about critical thinking and about questioning. And, of course, we learned this from our younger generation as well. This is why I love to sit with youth, because they forced you to think. They ask questions. I do a lot of teaching at various colleges and universities here in Toronto. And the beauty of it is that, my lecture is only 1/4 of the session. The rest of it is questions and answers, because the questions force us to think. And it's very comfortable for me to say, I don't know this. I don't have an answer, but I'll find out. So what it has forced us to do, and I say us because my husband and I work in these issues together, is it has brought us back to reading. and a critical discussion. Now, reading is something that has fallen off the table to a great extent because now you Google a response to everything and you Google an answer. I still like the feel of a hard book. I still like the feel of a real
You and me
newspaper.
both.
Yes, I love to read, and I have to read because in order to pass on the message, in order to teach, I must first learn. And I think the humility of understanding that we are human beings who don't have a knowledge of the whole world and many of the things around us, it comes from interaction. One of the best learnings for me was when 30 years ago I came to Canada. The first thing that I got involved in was interfaith dialogue.
Right.
I was so fascinated by other faiths and other communities, and I wanted to know how have they dealt with, immigration, with westernization, with being observant and faithful believers in a different country, in a different atmosphere, in a different environment. How do they bring up their children? And this came through dialogue.
Right.
Honest dialogue, not just fluff stuff, not just about your Diwali and my Eid, which is great, but much more than that.
What did you find in talking to people of different backgrounds? What is it? Did it work? Like, do you find that it's working, that people have been able to, raise their children and go about, living their life? Do they feel conflicted in doing it, or are they generally finding a way to balance those two things? What did you take away from that?
Well, first of all, what I took away was that we are more alike than we are different. It doesn't matter which background, which faith, which culture we come from.
Right.
I think there is a line in the Quran which became a reality for me, and that is that humanity is one community. That we are first human, and then we are a different culture or a different faith. So that's something that really shouted itself out at me. And that only came because I started having discourse with other people. And to my amazement, I found that many of the conflicts, many of the challenges were so similar because, we are parents, we have children, we are living in a community, and our challenges are very similar. Now, some communities, of course, especially in the West, have been here much longer than we have, and they have managed to overcome some of the challenges. But generally, the challenges are the same. All of us worry about how our children are going to turn out. All of us worry about a better future for our children. All of us worry about extremism and radicalization of various sorts. There's the whole drug issue out there. There's various problems that our youth face.
Right.
So when we have an honest, and I have to keep on stressing the word honest, it has to come from the heart, which means that sometimes we have to be critical about our own values and rethink them and say that, okay, I left my native country, the country I was born in, by choice, and I came to Canada. So let me learn from Canadian values. Let me absorb some of the most beautiful things in this country and in return share some of my values. Because, there are Eastern values about hospitality and about family, which are very different and which are heartwarming to the Western mind. So it's about exchange.
Right.
It's about ideas, and it's about exchanging ideas and having better ideas than those who are using their ideas to brainwash our youth.
It's interesting that you brought that back to ideas, because at the end of the day, that really is it. It's this a conversation about ideas, or it's a war about ideas or anything. But at the end of the day, everything that's manifested around us started as an idea in somebody's brain at some point. And some have spread, and some have stood the test of time, and some just haven't. But it's interesting that most people in the world just genuinely want to live in peace. They want to be able to put food on the table, know that their kids have got an education, and all of the sort of cliche things that any family or any individual would want. And yet somewhere in the middle of it, we've got all of this noise from politics to religion to dogma to tribalism and all of these different pieces. And I often wonder, when you see two people kind of come to a similar conclusion about humanism and sort of basic human values and freedoms, I do have to ask, like, over the long term, maybe not over the next 50 years, but over the long term, do you think that religion and faith is a necessary prerequisite for society as a whole to live in a sort of a good, peaceful manner? Or do you see religion playing some role for only some period of time and eventually we arrive at something else?
If you look at the history of the world, I think that religion can be a wonderful thing as long as it is a personal matter. Where it can become complicated is when it gets intertwined with politics. And this is what we see happening today. I mean,
Right.
take any religion, whether it's Catholicism, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, there has been a massive rise of dogma, ritualism, and fundamentalism in all these faiths across the board.
Right.
And you can see the negative impact of this, especially on our youth. And I keep talking about the youth because they are the future of tomorrow. The work that I do is for the betterment of our next generations because they're going to have to take the ball and run with it. And I believe that the challenges for them are much more than they were for us because perhaps we weren't open to so many ideas.
Right.
So that had its benefits at that time that, you had a tunnel vision and you only believed what you were told. It worked for that time, but it doesn't today because technology, while it's got all its benefits, I think to some extent has also taken away that concept of dialogue and discussion and debate, which is so important for the growth of any community and any society. And it has to be dialogue across the board, not just within our own communities and our own people. Even the word community has become somewhat tainted because, people say, what is community?
Right.
I'm asked, what is your community? So my community are the people that I live with, which doesn't mean that they're people like me. It doesn't mean that they're people of my original nationality or my color or my faith. My community is the people that I interact with all the time.
Right.
And they're different people. They're diverse people. So that, in that sense, diversity is a huge blessing because that helps us learn so much more. You think about these things when we first came to Canada and my sons were very young. There was this discussion about, should we put them in private school, Catholic school, public school? And we specifically and thoughtfully opted for public school because I believe that, in the public school system, they would be exposed to this diversity that I'm talking about. And it was a good decision because they were. And so
Right.
when they would bring their friends, and if I ever made the mistake of asking my son, who are your friends? What faith are they? Or, what they would get offended. So we don't ask them what they believe in. They're our friends. Mm-hmm. So we learn from our children. We learn from the people around us. We learn from reading. We learn from our experiences. But today, much to my regret, I see that the world has become so polarized and ghettoized. That people are living in their own boxes. They don't think outside the box. They don't speak outside the box. So if someone is different, they don't have that many opportunities to express their opinions.
Well, the sad thing I find is that different has now become equivalent to better or worse. When different is just different, we add a sort of moral dimension to it or a value dimension to it. Two people from two different cultures with two different ways of thinking, neither is necessarily better or worse. I'll caveat that because I think there's a certain basic human fundamental element around that. But it was interesting. I was in an Uber with some friends. We were going out for dinner after a concert a couple weekends ago. And the Uber driver that picked us up, and I love talking to drivers because you always get the real deal from them.
I love talking to taxi drivers and Uber drivers.
You just never know what conversation's about to play out. So this guy was... He kind of overheard some of our conversation. He started to interject, and he had this very, very heavy, like gravitas in his voice, very raspy voice, and he really should be an orator. Anyhow, it turns out this gentleman is from Libya. He's been here 4 years. His wife is doing a PhD here, and he didn't want to feel like he was some schmuck while his wife was going and getting her PhD. So he's been out working and driving with Uber and working on his English. And his English was already quite good, but you could tell he had some trouble with some complex concepts. So anyways, in the conversation, he randomly asked, so is it true? I saw a video on YouTube that, there's this religion in India, there's many religions. I don't know, it's like Hindu or something. This is the way he's speaking, and that you pray to the cow. So it was interesting. It was kind of a comedic moment that he asked us this question, and then we kind of clarified the context on where that's coming from. And even within the car, there was at least 2 or 3 different opinions amongst us on where that particular tradition comes from. But he went on to say, he's like, I've been told by many people, just don't talk about politics and religion. But I say, why not? Like, why not have conversations with people? So my message to him was, whoever's telling you not to have these conversations, don't listen to him. If you feel like talking about somebody, you have an opportunity in this country to do it, because we're not going to get closer by putting up guards around certain things. Nothing really should be taboo, because then we don't really get to know each other then.
You are so right. And I'll tell you from my experience that I've been doing public speaking for 30 years now. And, I've spoken to diverse audiences, religious audiences, spiritual audiences, total secular audiences, very right-wing audiences. And the first thing I say to them is that there is no question that is taboo. There is nothing that is off the record. And that's what I'm saying to you as well. Because as soon as we put those caveats, we stop the conversation. And if we get offended, and I'll tell you that as a Muslim woman, some of the questions that I have been asked have been absolutely mind-boggling. There was an incident when I took my son, who was in high school with me, because I was speaking to grade 9 high school students. They study world religion. So they asked me to come and speak about Islam. So I took him along because I thought, same age, it'll be something that we can deal with. And so one boy at the end in the question and answers asked me, how many wives does your husband have? And my son I could see him bristle.
Wow.
because he thought that this was
that would be a hard question to listen to.
A hard question. And I laughed. I said, you can never be offended, because that's when you stop the conversation. Right. So I laughed and I said, as far as I know, I'm the only one. But if I ever find out any different, I'll let you know. And the beauty of it was that it opened an opportunity for me to have a conversation with them about why in the Quran it mentions that men can marry 4 times. See, now this is something that needs a much greater explanation, and it allowed me the opportunity to give them that explanation. And this would not happen if I had said, you can't ask me this question. So I've been asked, questions like, why are your sons not terrorists? So I sat my sons down and I said, someone asked me, why aren't you terrorists? Because you're Muslim, you're young, you fit the profile. And they looked at me and said, Mom, you've really lost your marbles. And I said, no, it's a very valid question. And I want you to tell me. And they said, because you taught us. You taught us the values of human life. And this is what I mean, coming back to your question, that religion and faith can be a wonderful thing. Although when you look around, I see that more and more younger people are becoming more secular. Mm-hmm. Even in our Muslim community, many young people are leaving the faith. Now, there's a reason for that. It's because their questions are not answered. They sometimes feel so frustrated by what they see around them. Between the mosque and the mall, there is no safe space for them. And that's what I want to create. Our organization wants to create a platform where we can have circles of open, free, untainted dialogue and discussion with no barriers.
Right.
So that young people, and I can, only start with our youth who are very confused. There is no doubt about that, because they don't have those safe spaces. So what they do is, and sometimes they just get frustrated and they leave the faith. So this, the numbers of ex-Muslims or those who have left Islam is growing by the day. Now, this can be very dangerous for them, because in some countries, even today in Pakistan, that is considered blasphemy and it's punishable by death. So, it's scary for them, and many of them don't share that with their parents, because the parents are still living back home.
Right.
They may have physically moved to the West, and these are the challenges of immigration, but their mindset has not changed.
It's frozen in time there.
It's frozen in time. And I just heard some wonderful lectures by a scholar last week where he spoke about the fact that since the time of creation, humanity has evolved. And in fact, he said something that was, he was an Islamic scholar who had come from England. And I'll tell you, the community was in shock because he said something that was so mind-boggling and thought-provoking. He said that it's always been the one creator and the one God. It's just that the messages have come at different times to different people through different prophets, but the essence of the message is the same. The form has changed. And it evolves. And he included Sikhism and Hinduism, and Judaism, Catholicism, all faiths, Zoroastrians. And this was something new for the community, So they were sort of sitting back and thinking about it. But that's what we need. We need someone to shake our dogma. And this has been my journey, is to question everything and to realize that we evolve as humans. And so does our faith system and our beliefs. They have to move with the times. Otherwise, we are in quicksand and we are held down.
And I think you've hit something really important there, is this idea of evolution. It's amazing that we have evolved biologically, over millions of years, and over at least the last 2 million as Homo sapiens. We've essentially taken over the planet largely because we are the only creature that can coordinate and collaborate in large numbers to do something, in literally millions. And often at the root of that is an idea. It's the idea that there is an enemy out there, or that there is a cause out there, or we should all come together, or whatever that idea might be. But the idea is that thing that binds us all. And yet, when we go into a world that is increasingly polarized and sort of wrestling with all of these questions around everything from climate change to global warming to nuclear war, to even just how to be kinder to each other, almost no religion, at least in its original form, really addresses many of those questions. Like, everything else in the world has been evolving, and yet we have this expectation that we should keep looking back at the ancient, and it should stand there as a snapshot in time and be relevant. To me, it's even more ridiculous than what's just happened in Ontario with trying to roll back the sex ed curriculum from the 2015 curriculum to 1998, where, back before 2000, there wasn't really much around sexting or cyberbullying. This idea of consent wasn't so important. Yes. And now today, to roll back to something like that, it just seems ridiculous. Now we take that and we take the approach of religion, and you're rolling it back 1,400 years or 2,500 years or 5,000 years, whatever the number might be. So it feels odd that we don't expect of ourselves as the stewards, not just the inheritors, but the stewards of faiths and whatnot, that it shouldn't be evolving. And I think that's been one of the main reasons I've seen people just kind of fall like flies out of various faiths. I would say even my own relationship with religion and stuff is kind of it's changed a lot, I think, even since, you and I first met. And I don't necessarily think that it's a prerequisite to be a good human being. And I think for many decades, it was really the thing, or for most of human history, was this idea that without religion or faith, how can you be a good person? And I don't necessarily subscribe to that anymore. I think that there are good and bad things, and it's a tool that you can take from, and you can make whatever you want of it. But it's interesting that we're kind of in this time today.
I agree with you that you don't have to, that religion is not the core of teaching you about morals and ethics. That's something you learn at your mother's knee, how to be a good person.
Right.
You see, and good and evil exists with or without religion. I think religion and faith and spirituality can be is a spiritual crutch for many people. They want it in their lives, and I think they should have the freedom of being as spiritual or religious as they want. Now, as a person who's part of a Muslim reform movement, and the fact that we are trying to bring Muslims into the 21st century, I named my organization Muslims Facing Tomorrow,
right,
as opposed to facing the 7th century. This is a huge crisis within the Muslim communities and within the Muslim faith, where, again, it's about constantly looking back instead of looking forward.
Right.
And, it definitely holds you back, even as a human being, because we have to evolve with time. We have to make Islam relevant for us in the 21st century. Otherwise, our young people are not interested. They don't want to be taught about a faith that, evolved in the 7th century. Yes, the foundations of the faith are there. They don't change. Again, I said the essence. But the form has to change. the form must evolve and be relevant to them. So many young people have stopped going to the mosque, many young Muslims, because they don't find it relevant to their day-to-day life. And unfortunately, the dogma, the ritualism is being embedded more and more. And to some extent, I think that the religious leadership of all faiths has failed us. Has failed us miserably, because these religious leaders are so concerned about the pulpit. They're so concerned about their control. And of course, the patriarchy is embedded in there, especially when you look at the South Asian faiths. All of them are patriarchal, without doubt. And the religious leadership is not addressing day-to-day issues. Are they talking about the LGBTQ community? Are they talking about marriage outside the faith? Are they talking about interfaith marriages? So as a result, I am performing interfaith marriages. That's not something I set out to do. But I mentor young people. So if a young Muslim girl comes to me and says that I want to marry a boy who is a Christian and he doesn't want to convert, or a Hindu or a Jew, I do their spiritual marriage ceremony, because no religious leader will do that without forcing conversion. So just one example of how we are not moving with the times.
Right.
But then I have my own family. Both my sons have married outside the faith and the culture. And it's a beautiful relationship, because it has taught us so much more about respect, about tolerance, about accepting others. And that is what we seem to be losing in this whole world of technology, is that respect and tolerance.
Right.
It goes such a long way to have a conversation. Definitely don't need to agree.
No. And if everyone agreed, this would actually be a very boring world.
Yes, and disagreement is wonderful. And, I love questions and discussions, but it has to be respectful.
Right. So I want to take a little bit of a left turn here, because you've said something a couple of times, that being a good human being is kind of taught at the mother's knee. And I know obviously you take an incredible amount of pride as a mother and a grandmother, in that your circle that you're influencing is much bigger than just you, yourself, and your family, and it's much needed. I've been, over the last few years, been thinking a lot about this. What is the one sort of consistent thing through human history and our human present around what's broken? And I find if you looked at, nearly every terrorist attack, every instance of domestic abuse, of corporations exploiting, impoverished countries, at the end of it, the one who's executing it is more often than not a man, and more often than not broken. And when I say broken, I do feel human beings, all of us, are to some extent broken. We might have a hairline fracture. It might be a compound fracture. But the case of men is a unique one, in that when you have particularly young, disenfranchised men who don't have career prospects, may not have the right guidance, it's really easy to turn them in one way or another into either being violent or exploitative. If you looked at many CEOs in top global companies, if you were to actually diagnose them, they would have essentially the same profile of a psychopath, in that they're not necessarily in touch and empathetic with the outcomes of their actions. You can fire tens of thousands of people. You can destroy an entire economy and have millions of people commit suicide, is what happened, after the 2008 crash in the US, and yet get off scot-free. And at the end of the day, it's almost always a man who's at the end of this. And I got to thinking, particularly now having both a son and daughter, what is it about the way that we raise our boys and our men that allows itself to manifest over and over? Yes, women have issues, and yes, women also perpetrate many ills, but what is it uniquely about men? And I'm curious to know, from your perspective, having two sons and, kind of being out in the world, where do you stand on this? What do you think we can do about that specific issue?
It's very interesting that you brought this up, because just yesterday I was at an event about empowering women, and I was speaking to a crowd of 300 South Asians, both men and women, and this particular topic about boys and the upbringing of men by the mothers came up and became a very important component of the conversation. And, we have a saying in our tradition that if you educate a boy, you educate an individual. But when you educate a girl, you educate a family, you educate a village, a tribe, a nation. Now, when I say educate, I don't mean necessarily secular education in a school and a university.
Sure, yeah.
I'm talking about enlightenment, vision, empowerment. And this is something that has fallen off the table in many of our South Asian countries and our communities, the importance of giving that equal education to the girls. And I also go back to the basic upbringing of boys. They become what they see. So again, we do come from patriarchal cultures, and we haven't been able to break that cycle of patriarchy. And so the sense of entitlement that the boys have, and this is in the West as well.
Yeah,
This
there's
is
no
a
culture
global,
that's not patriarchal.
Yes. There are levels of
Sure,
patriarchy. It's just the difference is that in the West, women have been empowered and educated, and they have fought for their rights. Excuse me, for far longer than we have had an opportunity. So but it's a struggle. You can see that it is a constant struggle. So the sense of entitlement that is given to the males, the sense of empowerment over others that is given to them, the sense of control over others' lives, that has to change. I mean, this has to be a radical change of mindset. And it definitely comes down to the mothers, of how mothers and fathers, by the way, of how they bring up boys and girls in the same household.
Right.
And, I can speak to that because I have two boys. In our home, they saw gender equality. They saw equality. They saw partnership. They saw freedom of expression.
Right.
And so they have grown up to become real feminists. Sometimes to the extent that I joke that, you are more mothers to your children than your wives are.
Right.
But they would never consider anything else because this is how it's been taught to them. So those examples are extremely important. You as a father know this, especially if you have both genders as children, how you bring them up, how you teach them, how you teach them to live their lives.
Right.
Is extremely important. And that eventually resonates down the generations.
This has been my own experience as well. I've been very fortunate that my parents had each left India in the 60s. They were in Europe for almost 10 years before they got married, and then they moved to Canada. So they'd already had quite a bit of evolution individually. And when they met as equals. And they met as, my father wanted to marry somebody who had her own vision, who wanted to have her own drive and her own career, and he would have his own as well. And growing up, I always saw Dad doing the dishes, cleaning up around the house, not letting us just leave stuff lying around because it's not Mom's job to pick it up. But what I grew up with was not my father telling me what to do and how to be a man. It was just him being a man and me watching that. And years later as an adult, I appreciate more and more nuance around that because there's little things that'll come up in conversations over scotch, when he's visiting. And I'll realize I picked up something from him that he didn't even actually tell me. And so I think that's really critical. And then I look out to today's world, and I know you had seen when I'd released that piece, Baby Girl, which I'd written for my daughter. And I wrote that as essentially a love letter to her to believe in herself. And no matter what the world tells her, because she's a girl does not mean that she can or cannot do something. She is her own person, full stop. And when we were making the video, she kept asking me, Daddy, why are you making this video? Why are you writing this? She was 5 at the time, so it didn't really make a lot of sense. And I told her, because someday somebody's going to tell you that you can't do something because you're a girl. Not even 2 weeks after I had released the piece, I picked her up from school. She was in kindergarten at the time, and she told me about her day. She's saying, I did this, and I played with this person and whatnot, and then we were playing superheroes, and these boys told us that we couldn't play with superheroes. And so I asked her, well, back up. What did these boys say to you? They said that girls can't play with superheroes. They're not good at it. And I asked her, what did you tell them? And we just told them that girls can do anything. I'm like, okay, see, somebody's already telling you that. And I didn't make much of it. But then on the drive home, I thought a little bit about it. How do 2 5-year-old boys already have this idea in their head that there's some things girls can do and some things girls can't. They may or may not have picked it up from their parents. They may have picked it up from other kids in the schoolyard or from TV or anything. But these messages are all around them, and they're telling boys there are things that girls can't do. And then girls are still being told at the same time, you can do anything you want. But we're not giving them the same message consistently. And I thought this needs to change, because if I'm leaving this world behind for them, I have as much of a role to play in both, making sure that those messages are in alignment with each other. And that's just not the case yet.
It's not the case yet, but we are getting there slowly. And we have to. There is no choice, because we can't continue with this. I mean, yesterday, I heard from a gentleman who actually mentors young South Asian men and does classes for them, and he's been doing this for 30 years. Mm-hmm. And some of the stories he told us were absolutely horrific in terms of how these young men, born and brought up here, no poverty, no economic instability, have grown up with this sense of entitlement that they are better, that they are special, and that, women are lesser human beings. Because it has been, this is what they have seen. So to your point, you can talk about it till the cows come home, but unless you live, that experience. So in the 30 years that I've been here and in the work that I've been doing, one of the major lessons that I have learned is that you can't just talk the talk. You have to walk the walk. So if I speak of pluralism and if I speak of respect and tolerance, and then I turn around and say that so-and-so is, criticize someone for being different and not accept who they are, then I'm not being true.
Right.
Then I'm giving a false impression. And this, of course, brings its own challenges, because within the Muslim communities, there are many taboos against the LGBTQ community, for example. In Muslim lands, it's horrific because they are liable to be killed. Mm-hmm. It's just not open for discussion and debate. But there is a large, thriving LGBTQ Muslim community, and they came to me and they reached out to me. So what do I do? So this brought critical thinking. I had to think about it. I had to read. I had to disseminate my own built-in taboos from the time that I grew up. Mm-hmm. So there has to be a change in the thinking. And I realized that I have to walk the walk.
Right.
If I don't embrace those who are different, and this is now part of our mandate in our organization, that we accept anyone or any person who walks a different path and follows a different way. What we are saying is that, you practice your faith any way you want. That is the freedom that we have. But as long as you're not forcing it on someone else, and as long as you're not going against human rights and resorting to violence.
Is there an idea around fundamental human rights as a thought experiment that is just so obvious and such a given that no matter what else is happening around it, that these things need to be preserved? And if so, what, in your opinion, do we need to do to get there as a society?
Well, there is the United Nations Charter of Human Rights, and it is a universal charter, and it is a beautiful charter. And while I have my own reservations about the legitimacy and the work of the United Nations, this is something that everyone can uphold. And that is what we have to do. I also believe that we have to look at faith, religion, any religion, through the lens of human rights and not the other way around. You see, this is what happens is that many people, religious leaders, will say, we have human rights embedded in our faith. No, you don't. Mm-hmm. If you are not tolerating others, if you are disrespecting others, if you are dehumanizing another person because they worship something other than what you believe in, then you are not observing the Universal Charter of Human Rights. So in the work that I do, I found it very relevant and very credible to say that when we look at issues of women's rights, for example,
right.
That's my big thing. So I'm dealing with honor killings. I'm dealing with forced and underage marriage. I'm dealing, with female genital mutilation cases, which all, by the way, are happening right here.
Right.
in Canada.
Yeah.
This is not
we,
something
we are
that-
not immune to all of
No,
this.
we are not. And it's happening here. People are not talking about it. It's taboo. But when I speak about these issues, I speak about them from the perspective of human rights. This is what is important. It's about a human being. And so I continuously remind people, and in my talk yesterday, I spoke about this. So one young girl stood up and said that, if I'm not a part of a particular faith, how do I criticize what is happening in that community or in that culture? I said, human rights. Human rights are above culture and faith and community. They stand
Right.
alone. And so I think we must all promote those universal human rights.
Are there cases, though, where there's just so little left in a given faith or set of beliefs that there's so little left after you filter away the things that don't reconcile with this fundamental idea of human rights, where that tradition no longer stays relevant? Because in many cases, that's much of what I hear from people, right? Like there's just so much of this that just doesn't agree with a modern life, for example, that doesn't make sense for me to keep bits and pieces of it. So some people just walk away from it completely, whereas others will find ways to kind of pick and choose pieces that they find relevant. And it is very much a personal journey. It's not necessarily happening to an entire society at large. I think for those who are religious, everyone has their own personal religion. No two people have the exact
Absolutely.
common interpretation of
Yes.
those things, and you'll put some more emphasis on one thing or the other. But if there is a fundamental set of beliefs around treatment of women, around education, around equality of pay, around freedom of speech and expression, all of those things, does it come to a point where there really is no connection or overlap between them? Or do you believe that you can find in every faith in every part of the world enough of a real rooting in human rights, in sort of a modern understanding of human rights, that faith can reform, be evolved, and continue to actually add value?
Well, I'm an eternal optimist. So I tend to believe that it depends on how you are looking at faith. If you're looking at faith just as dogma and rituals, then of course there's no room for change because,
Sure.
they're embedded. But if you look at faith as a set of beliefs and ideas, which is what I do believe, that every faith is a set of ideas. And those ideas can and must evolve. Only thing is that you have to have, revolutionary leadership. You have to have people with vision, and you have to have people who also believe in this, in universal values. And with time, that can change, because that's the only way it can be made relevant into people's lives today.
Right.
Otherwise, there are young people, especially, who are walking away because they see no value. They see that there can't be any change. I think in the work that we are doing with reform, we are looking at ways in which these ideas can evolve and change. As long as we believe that, every faith is a set of ideas. Mm-hmm. And, the dogma and ritual is, the worship part of it is a direct relationship between the human being and the Creator. Mm-hmm. And as you said, no one person has a similar relationship. Everybody worships in their own way. So if I were to say there are 1.10 billion Muslims in the world, I believe there are 1.10 billion versions of Islam on how they relate to the Creator. But the ideas can change, mm-hmm. Absolutely, and they need to definitely conform to human rights and human values.
Right.
It's interesting, this word moderate Muslim was being thrown around for a long time. And
yeah, what does it even mean?
What does it mean? So people would ask me, and I think that, the media had sort of forced us to use the term moderate Muslims because, for want of a better word, we wanted to distance ourselves from the extremists, so we started calling ourselves moderate or progressive. And then I came up with an idea, and I said, you know what, I'm going to call myself a humanist Muslim. Mm-hmm. Because I am a person of faith, I'm a practicing Muslim, but I'm a humanist.
Right.
And so, I just sort of threw that out. But that concept of humanity and human rights stands above everything else. And that's what I question. When I read something, when I look at ideas, when I see how people practice their faith, the first question I ask myself is this human? Is this humanitarian? Does this have respect for others?
Right.
And if it doesn't, then leave it aside.
when you take any idea and you politicize it, inevitably part of that politicization creates a power gap, a power vacuum. There are people who have and who don't have power in that equation. And you look at how perhaps much of the imperialist, exploitative capitalist markets work today, or if you look at the way governments work, the way that, the power dynamics you were talking about in the UN or religion, at the end of the day, you need to keep control of that power within a small circle of people. And in doing so, the moment that you start to see a mass of people who take things into their own hands, who become educated, who become aware, who can think for themselves and think critically, that is a direct threat to that power structure that's been ingrained, right? We're seeing that happen throughout, much of the Western world with the rise of populism in America. I don't think that Canada is immune. We've seen some of those waves here. You're seeing it in Western Europe. You're seeing, increasingly, bizarrely nationalist movements in India. Mm-hmm. But all of these different things are happening. And the moment somebody awakens and says, this doesn't make sense, that person is now a threat to the establishment. And, you are very much that person, I know, because you're the thorn in many people's sides. And I wonder, in the context of a system that wants to keep people ignorant, uneducated, uninformed, and distracted, what can we as individuals and as groups of people who don't necessarily have that same power, what can we do to change that? What are the things that you're doing to make that shift for us?
You see, who gives power to these people? Who gives power to the religious leadership? Who gives power to the politicians? Who gives power to those who are in power? We do.
Right.
So we have to stop giving that power. We must question those, because they are human beings. What we have been taught is that you don't question the people in power, right?
Right.
But we must. And this is what a democracy teaches us. This is what freedom and liberation teaches us. And this is something that we must all imbibe and teach our children and grandchildren as well. And they do, to a great extent. They question, but they're told, no, you can't question the religious leadership. Why not? They're not divine. Mm-hmm. Although they'd like to think that they are divine, sure. This is what they would like to promote. We must question that power. Mm-hmm. And not enough people are doing that because they're intimidated. They're scared. Now, the work that I do, and you mentioned, I am a thorn in the side of the religious leadership, of the political leadership. But of course, we do it with respect. So we have a prime minister. I don't necessarily agree with some of his policies. I respect the fact that he is my prime minister, but I would question openly and blatantly, because that is my right as a citizen. That is my right as a human being, to question another person's power if it is not in sync, again, with human rights, or if it is not in sync with world peace. So, communities globally, people, citizens, must use that power to question. But having said this, that power to question has been stifled. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. We now have a motion called M103, and that motion is that you cannot criticize Islam or Muslims. Now, as a Muslim, I find that so offensive.
And just for clarity, for those who don't know, is that specifically only for Islam, or is there any other?
Well, the wording of it does have a broader context, but Islam is specifically mentioned. Now, I went to Parliament, to the Canadian Parliament, and gave testimony and witness that M103 is not a practical suggestion, that M103 is going to create more unrest. It's going to put people's back up against the wall. And you know what happens when there is a stifling of free speech and critical thought? That's when the rise of the right happens. Mm-hmm. You see this in Europe, where any criticism was stifled. But now you have people who are so frustrated because they can't ask questions. Why shouldn't a Canadian citizen be able to ask questions about terrorism, about extremism? There have been extremist attacks in Canada. Yeah. And I'm speaking to you now as a Muslim activist, that I don't like the concept of M103. I want people to criticize Islam if they have any questions, because again, it gives us an opportunity to have a conversation. But when their criticism is stifled, then it builds up, it festers, and then it bursts open sometimes in very negative ways. We have seen this across the globe. In a lot of the work that I do, I remind Canadians to look at the European experience, which has been a very unpleasant experience in terms of the rise of the right because of the suppression of free speech. I've traveled across Europe on an educational trip and seen how the communities are dealing. Let me put it another way, how governments are not dealing with it. There are governments in Sweden who will look the other way. They don't want to deal with the rise of radicalization within their countries because it frustrates them. They don't know what to do. The police in Sweden would rather not go to a particular area. They will resign before they go to a certain part of the country where there are large ghettos of immigrants living.
To what do you attribute that resolving? Is it that they're afraid? Is it that there's a fear of being seen as bigoted or, not this the right term, but racist or whatnot? Is that what's driving this?
It's very simple. They're terrified to speak out because they're afraid they're going to be called bigots and racists, because this is how this victim ideology has grown. And this has been the success of the extremists. They're laughing because this is what they've done. They've terrified the Europeans from speaking out. There's also a sense of apathy in the government. So I was giving testimony to the Swedish government, and I asked them, I said, this is a beautiful country, which it is. You have so much infrastructure, economically stable. Why is there so much unrest? They said, well, we have so much that we are uncomfortable with this, so we want to spread the goodwill. Well, you do that, but you do it with reason and with knowledge and thinking about it. Ghettoizing certain communities in a particular part of your country and letting everything happen there, which is not part of human rights, is not the solution to the problem.
Right.
So turning the other, looking the other way and deflecting from the real issues and understanding we have a problem of radicalization in this country. It's not a huge issue. Why can't we talk about it?
We were talking about diversity earlier, and I think that diversity is one of those words that has so often misused and misunderstood. Having worked in various fields and been in so many meetings and conversations, diversity is usually reduced to, we've got this ad happening, we need to have one guy with a turban, we need to have one black woman, you need to have a white guy and somebody who looks Jewish.
You've nailed it.
That is not diversity, because all of them could be terrible people with the exact same moral compass, or all of them could be wonderful people, or more likely they're probably spread across the gamut. And even throughout history, like if you look at the civil rights movement in the U.S., Martin Luther King is celebrated today. He was vehemently hated by much of the civil rights movement. They did not agree with the way that he would go about trying to push African Americans to be like the white man in dress and in speaking manner, and trying to only be prim and proper. He loathed himself. He loathed many things that were sort of inherently black culture, because he didn't think that would give them the equal playing field and then allow white America to then grant them their rights. So even within a movement like civil rights, you have such a huge diversity of opinion. And in any movement, you're going to see that diversity of opinion in every part of the world. And yet, if we don't talk about it, nothing gets solved, but also I feel like this world of identity politics and victimology, it's a real shame, because albeit many ills throughout history have been perpetrated by white men. I mean, it's just been the history of the last, few thousand years, or at least few hundred years. But if a white man has a fair question or a fair opinion about something that is actually thought through and is clearly articulated, if he says something and it inevitably rubs somebody the wrong way from a different minority group, all of a sudden it's dismissed as racist or bigoted or coming from a place of privilege. And he may be coming from a place of privilege, but you should actually challenge the idea on its own merits, regardless of where it's coming from. But we are not allowing that diversity of ideas and opinions, and we're tying those opinions to the color of the skin or the gender of the person that it's actually coming from.
I agree with you 100%. To me, one of the biggest problems in this country, and I'm speaking of Canada, has been this concept of government-sponsored multiculturalism. Diversity has started being used as a buzzword. It's lost its meaning. I mean, even I use it very cautiously. The idea of multiculturalism, I mean, the government can't force people to like each other.
No.
We have to understand that people are different, and also, very importantly, all cultures are different. This doesn't mean that they are good or bad. But a culture that does not respect its women is not the same as a culture that respects its women. And so cultures are different, and we have to recognize that. But multiculturalism is this umbrella that wants to say that everybody is equal culturally and their values are the same and that you have to like each other. No. I have stood up often in my talks and told people that, you don't have to like Islam and you don't have to like Muslims because that is your freedom. All I want you to do is be knowledgeable about it. You must have the knowledge base to understand why is it that you don't like them. You must know what you're talking about. So my job is to educate you, and then the decision is yours. So this idea that we're all going to be warm and fuzzy, even in one family, people don't get along.
No.
It's very natural and it's very human not to get along. There may be a neighbor that I don't like. There may be a colleague that I don't like. Why do you have to feel guilty about it? As long as you are not disrespectful or resorting to violence and you're not killing people because you don't like them, the question is that it has to be organic.
Right.
In a country like Canada, where there is such a plethora of different communities and immigrants and colors and, just the beauty of it, let people decide if they want to get along or not. That is their freedom.
Right.
So this idea that diversity is the solution to all problems and that multiculturalism is going to solve our problems because we are going to la dance with each other in a circle, it's not going to happen.
Right.
And it has really been to a disadvantage because, this idea is promoted in schools. And as you said, it's become a buzzword where a person of color fills the mandate of the organization that is hiring people, that if you have 5 people of color, your mandate is filled. No, look at the qualifications.
Yeah, yep.
And in many ways, I will say this, much to a lot of people feeling hostile, that the white man has been the victim of this. The racism has been directed towards the white man because they can't open their mouth or say anything because of this whole idea. And I think that that's very unfair.
Right. It's funny, actually, this particular conversation comes up actually quite a lot because, friends of mine in different walks of life who are white men, maybe they're somewhat more cognizant of it now than, years ago. But on one hand, they do have a certain degree of privilege. There's no question about it. Walking into a room, walking into a meeting, being a middle-aged white man, it has a certain privilege associated with it in many corners of the world. And at the same time, that person may have worked for the last 20 years to be as open-minded and as accepting and honest as possible, is really working alongside of many different groups to really bring people together. And ironically, he's painted with the same brush as the last white guy who just happened to be a terrible person. And so this it's a strange dichotomy that's happening. And I think that it might be the first time, at least in the last several hundred years, where all of a sudden being a white man is not just privilege. There is some drawbacks to it. I still do believe there is a lot of privilege associated with it because I've seen how it's played out. But regardless, when someone makes a good point, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of their age or ethnicity or gender, if they make a good point and you discount that good point just based on who it's coming from, then you've lost something there. We all have to just embrace and accept the fact that a good idea is a good idea is a good idea.
And an individual is an individual. We have to deal with people on an individual basis. The idea of generalizing either groups or communities because of their color, because of their ethnicity, because of their nationality, or because of their gender is something that's become a common practice. I don't think that we are in a position to label anyone unless we have an individual connection. So it's with great difficulty I constantly remind myself not to generalize. Meet people, talk to them individually, deal with them individually, and decide for myself who this person is and whether they are of value or not.
So on that note, This is something that I think a lot of people have been wrestling with for, the recent times, especially with the rise of polarization. And you and I were talking about this. I despise using the terms left and right. Anything that seems like a real binary like that feels like it just automatically pits people against each other. Liberal versus conservative, all of these binary constructs, I don't think that they really help. In this polarized world, you're seeing more and more hostile attitudes coming up, and there's a whole gamut in between. And in that context, is there a limit that you would place on free speech? What does free speech really mean at the end of the day? I know the U.S. has, its First Amendment around it. Even Canada doesn't have anywhere within its constitution an actual constitutional protection of free speech. But what does free speech really mean? And is there a place that ends?
That's a very difficult question. It's a challenging question because we've been faced with it, in recent times. We're having these conversations about whether there should be limits on free speech. I personally do not believe that we should place any limits on free speech. I believe that free speech is exactly that, the freedom to say whatever a person wants, as long as they are not promoting violence or resorting or encouraging anyone to promote violence. That's a different thing altogether. But, again, I'll give you an example. We've had recent cases of Geert Wilders, speaking out against Islam and the Prophet and the Quran. I mean, this happens all the time. It's happened since the time, since the inception of Islam. I don't think that it harms my faith if people insult it or if they say. It's not a good thing because I personally would not disrespect or insult anyone else's faith. But that's my morals and ethics. I've learned that if I want respect, I need to give respect. However, at the same time, if someone insults my faith, I believe they have that freedom to do so. And we should be able to engage in dialogue. And I can't tell you the number of times I have been at events where someone has stood up and slammed my prophet, my holy book, my faith, and I have given them the benefit of that free speech and used it as an opportunity to engage in conversation. So I personally don't want to ever put limits on free speech, although there are people who say that, there should be. Now, on the other side, look at the amount of hate that is being perpetuated through curriculums, through events. I mean, it's out there. That hate is what is creating the divisions. It's not the free speech that's creating the divisions. It's the hate that is being taught. In Saudi Arabia, the curriculum of school children teaches them to hate Jews and Christians. We rarely talk about that. Right here in Canada, there are events. There is the BDS movement that's teaching people to hate Israel. Let's have a conversation. We don't have to agree with any country's political side. We don't have to agree, as I said, but we should be able to have a conversation. But there is definitive hate being taught. That is what I think needs to go. That is what we should target.
Do you think that the people who are the puppet masters that design these curriculums, that come up with these ideas, drive these movements, do you think that they themselves genuinely hate the other? Or are they using this hate as a concept to further their own political and power and monetary agendas? Like, do you believe that hate in its original form is true and real?
In some cases, I believe the hate is true and real, because when an entire generation has been taught to hate another person, another community, or another country, then it becomes embedded. They think that it is real. And this is where the fake news, where the politics, where propaganda comes into play. So yes, to some extent, when the same thing is being told to you over and over and over again, then it becomes a reality for many people. They can't differentiate between the black and white. There's no gray area for them. On the other hand, of course, hate is also used as a political tool. How else would you be able to harm another person unless you were taught to hate them and therefore dehumanize them? Because this thought and this conversation often comes up. How does one human being pick up a weapon and harm another person? In our thinking, in our life, that is unthinkable.
Sure, yeah.
We could never think of doing that. But then the power of hate is so strong. And that is the only tool that is used. And I can tell you about communities where hate is taught from the age of 2 to young children over and over again. They are taught to hate a particular group. It becomes a reality for them that these are hateful people. They must not live. Therefore, killing them or harming them is justified.
When people come at some point in their life, let's take a child who's been raised in this manner and has been force-fed this idea of hating some other group or groups of people, their entire life, and they kind of come to this realization that, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. Have you heard from those people? Have you spoken to people who've kind of come out of that sort of upbringing and then they realize that something is not quite right? Have you come across those people, and what do they tell you?
And they tell us exactly what I am telling you. They say, I was so filled with hate that I couldn't see anything else. My mind was so filled with hate and rage that all I wanted to do was lash out at these people that we had been taught to hate. In our work, we do come across these people. We mentor them. Sometimes they change. Sometimes that hate is so deeply embedded that they don't. That is the level of where the hate then transforms itself into violence. These are people that we call radicals. So one of the programs that I'm involved with doing is trying to intervene before that stage, is, trying to intervene with young people who perhaps have been sidelined by this hate, is to find them democratic and easy solutions to vent their anger. Anger is a very natural thing. Yeah. There are people,
we're human.
They're frustrated, you're human, you're angry at the state, you're angry at the government, you're angry at the establishment. These are the people that the manipulators play on. They play on them, they find them, they play on their minds, and then they say, okay, we will find you a way to vent your anger and your hate. Here, take a weapon and use it. And they do, without thinking logically. So, in the work, as I said, we have come across these people. And it is inevitably the hate that is either taught to them in places of worship or hate that has been taught to them at home. It happens in many cases where you're just taught to hate the other person because they are the other.
We're even hearing, second and third hand about some of that in schools in certain parts of, Toronto, parts of Mississauga, where kids won't play with other kids. The first thing they'll ask is, what religion are you? And they won't play with them. And I just find that sad, because to come to a country like this, for all of its flaws, I mean, Canada is by no means perfect. We have an abysmal, not even history, our current situation in our treatment of our Aboriginal, really the people that were here first, that we are all indebted to for even allowing us to stay, the way that we treat them. There's many other issues that we have here, but in many ways, this is a remarkable and incredible country. And to come to this place and then not give yourself the opportunity to expose yourself to the plethora of people and ideas and diversity, and I mean diversity in the truest sense here, and to try and keep yourself in this ghettoized mindset is just such a shame, because to come and just benefit economically, I think is only part of the promise, part of this experiment that is Canada or the United States, for that matter, is to be able to come and build something new and build it together. And why wouldn't you want to be a part of that? I just find that so disappointing. I didn't grow up like that, but I know many people who have, that were kept in an insular way. You'd go outside the house and you would kind of interact with the rest of society, but you are nothing but the person that your parents brought you over, and you were carrying all of those same ideas. It doesn't work. And you see that conflict play out.
You see that, and for the next generation, it's extremely important that we replace the hate with love. And even though it may sound like a fluffy idea to say that you love everyone, but at least respect them. If you don't love them, respect them. And this is what I teach my grandchildren, that if you want respect, you must give respect. They come to us with stories about bullying in the playground, and kids using racist language, and you often think, what kind of upbringing have these kids had? So I tell them, don't react to it. You must always react with respect. If someone is bullying you, well, bullying is a different thing, but if, someone is disrespecting you or being racist, you don't have to be racist back to them.
Right.
And this happens all the time. I mean, this is here in Canada. My sons have had racist remarks thrown at them, for being brown and Muslim. And you just have to learn to ignore that. But we are allowing too much of this to fester. We are allowing too much of this to happen. We do need to replace the values. And again, I come to the values. It's so important that we talk about human values, the values that we teach our children. And this does not have to be religion. It has to be the values of humanity and of interacting with each other. And, we must take this further because the next generation has enough challenges that they will face because of what kind of a world they're living in. Let's not teach them hate. Take that away.
I think just to kind of come slightly full circle here, I mean, love absolutely can and hopefully will trump the hate. However, at the same time, it's not just love of others, it's also self-love, right? That's the thing, and that's kind of at the root of why I have been, spending some time thinking about the situation of men and boys in general, because at the end of the day, if you don't love yourself, it becomes really difficult to love other people because not loving yourself and having some sort of favorable feelings to other people might be seen as envy or something. And it's a different emotion. There's a different mechanism at play. And so too often boys are told to man up. They're told that boys don't cry. Even today, and I know it's gotten a lot better in this generation than it was in previous generations, but even now, toughen up, boys don't cry. But if you're a boy and you have an emotion and you don't understand it and you just feel like crying or feel like talking about it and you're shut down over that emotion isn't going to go away. It might get suppressed for a bit, it'll fester and it'll come out in some other way. And you take enough of those shutdowns over a lifetime and that manifests itself in different ways. And I believe that we do a better job of raising our girls to be strong and independent and yet still preserving that sense of vulnerability and empathy and whatnot, but we haven't done necessarily as good at a job with our boys. And so if we are to love each other and be tolerant of each other, I think we also need to love and appreciate ourselves, but we also need to be able to be critical and confident enough that when something critical is raised about us, like a real critique, whether it's personally or as part of the society that you are from or your background, you should be able to take that in stride and evaluate it for what it is and not love yourself less as a result. And I believe that self-love, as cheesy and corny as it sounds, is the thing at the end that is kind of a catalyst for transforming men and women for that matter and societies as a whole. But we are too often distracted from loving ourselves, being constantly focused on through the media and social media and advertising and whatnot on here's all of the great things out there that money and power and status and a fair skin color and all this stuff is going to buy. So in doing all of that, without saying you should hate yourself, all we're saying is you should love all of these other things that you are not. And it creates this gap within an individual. So I think there's this societal transformation that we have yet to make. And this is globally.
Absolutely.
In every walk of life, in every different piece of infrastructure that we've laid for our societies is rampant with this same phenomena. And so I feel if we can resolve it and figure out a way to resolve it in one place, we can learn something from that there and apply it to the next and the next and the next.
Absolutely. It's something, again, it has to be a change in our thinking. It has to be an evolve. We have to evolve. We have to change the ways in which we are bringing up our children. And definitely, I hope that change will come. And we talked so much about human rights and human values. I want to end with a saying from a very famous philosopher and poet called Sadi, many centuries ago, who said, "Human beings are like the parts of one body. If one part hurts, the rest of the body is also affected. So, you who have no feeling for another human are not fit to be called human." So this is what we have to consider, that we are all one humanity and we have to care for ourselves and for each other.
Absolutely. Well, we are all better off for someone like you maintaining the optimism and the passion and the fire that you do. This has been a privilege to get a chance to speak with you. I think that you're an inspiration for just people in general. And it's also just never too late to find out whatever that voice is. And I know you've been on this road of finding this passion and doing what you believe that is the thing that you're either brought here to do or the thing that you can contribute to the world. Before we close, for people out there who are constantly struggling with, I don't know what I can do, or I don't know what it is that motivates me or impassions me, what guidance would you give them?
Well, do a little thinking, do some reflection. It's important to separate yourselves from the material surroundings, which is the technology. And I think that many people don't allow themselves the benefit of thinking because they're afraid of where their thoughts will take them. So they're so caught up into, they're listening to meditative series, they're plugged into their phones and their computers, and they're searching for spirituality. I think that search for spirituality, this is non-religious spirituality,
Sure. Yeah.
is a human endeavor, and each one of us is searching for that. So allow yourselves that privilege. Let yourself go free. Think about what it is, and everyone has a different talent that they can offer. This is my belief, that there is so much talent and there is so much people can give in different ways. When I mentor young women, a lot of them, and a young girl came to me yesterday as well and said, I want to do the kind of work that you do. Maybe not everybody has that freedom and benefit to be able to be an activist like I am, because, there are families, there are commitments, there are things that hold them back. It's do whatever your passion wants you to do. Do whatever your heart wants you to do. The heart is a great thing. Listen to your heart. Sometimes not so much the mind, but the heart. And
Right.
The heart will tell you what it is that your journey is, what it is that you want to do, and then just do it.
Yeah, just do something.
Do something.
Do something. Yes. Yeah, I agree with you. I think
Don't be apathetic. Don't just sit back and think I can't make a difference. Don't just think someone else will do it.
Right. Yeah.
You see, I have to do what I have to do.
I think so many people today, and perhaps always, are just we're too afraid to be alone with ourselves.
Yes.
And until you actually do that, you don't hear whatever that voice is or figure out that. I'm fully on the same page. Everyone has their unique gift and their unique thing that they bring to the table, that they bring to the world. And I think so few of us actually give ourselves a chance to figure out what that could be and just take a little bit of a risk on ourselves. So
it's so liberating, when you finally are able to use that talent or use that passion. And it could be anything. It could be one drop in the ocean that makes the difference.
Absolutely.
And to me, it's not the larger picture. It's that one drop that matters.
And it has to start somewhere.
It has to start somewhere, yes.
So for everyone listening, where can they find out more about you and your work?
My website is www.muslimsfacingtomorrow.com. If they Google my name, they will get so much information that it will boggle their minds, but that is something that's out there. Everything I do is totally transparent, so it's all out on the internet, sometimes to my detriment, but pick and choose and see what path they want to follow.
Well, Raheel ji, thank you so much for being here today, and I hope that we can continue this conversation in the future. Would love to have you back.
I hope so too, and thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity to speak about my work.
Thank you. If you'd like to support the AwokenWord podcast, there are many ways you can do it. You can subscribe in your app of choice. We're on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, or TuneIn, for example. The biggest thing that you can do is rate this podcast and leave your review in iTunes or wherever you listen to it. You can also talk about this podcast, its guests, or the ideas shared on it in your own podcasts. If you find benefit in this show, tell your friends, tell your family, and even more importantly, tell your enemies. They'll appreciate it too. And of course, you can also follow us on social media, particularly on Twitter. Our handle there is @AwokenWord, on Instagram as @AwokenWord Podcast, or on our Facebook page. Thank you. Your support is greatly appreciated.